All right, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. Today we're going to be looking at the resurrection, hoax or history. The big overall question is, did Jesus really rise from the dead? A little bit about me. I am a graduate of Washington Bible College, and then I went into law enforcement. I joined the Fairfax County Police Department, which is in Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., and I spent 29 years in law enforcement, 14 years as a police officer handling calls on the street, and then 15 years as a detective. And they claim, and I was a property crimes detective, and they claim that property crimes are some of the most difficult cases to solve because they're more difficult because there's less evidence than other cases. They often don't have any witnesses. There's often don't have any suspects. And I primarily worked two types of cases. This was about 90% of the cases I worked was burglaries and thefts. Burglaries being breaking into a home or a business, usually for the purpose of stealing, or thefts. Now tonight, we're going to look at a judge or a jury. What do they do? They are not there. When you go to court, the judge and the jury, they weren't there when the event happened. And by the way, it happened in the past. Judges and juries are there to decide what happened, and that is driven by evidence. And today we're going to look at a historical event, just like a judge and jury would. We're going to look at something that happened in the past, and we're going to see what evidence is for or against the resurrection. And then we're going to make a determination of the guilt or innocence, which is something a judge or a jury is supposed to do. But before we get into that, I want to quickly look at the burdens of proof standards in court that's used in the judicial system. And at the bottom of this pyramid of the burdens of proof, the lowest one and the easiest one to attain is called reasonable suspicion. And with that, you just have an idea that someone did something, but you really don't have anything concrete. There's not much you could do with reasonable suspicion, at least for our purposes here tonight. But then the next level is called probable cause, something that you all have probably heard before. Now, probable cause is specific facts that would lead a person to believe that there's a fair probability that a crime has been committed. Now, with probable cause, I can get a warrant for your arrest. And with probable cause, I can get a search warrant to go to your house and go through everything in your house looking for property. So yes, you can do a lot with probable cause, but still in the burdens of proof standard, it's still pretty low on the pyramid. The next one is called preponderance of evidence. This is the standard usually used in civil cases, and it's often represented as a balance scale. And it's simply which side it has a little bit more weight than the other, and that's where your decision needs to go. In other words, it looks like this. If the one side puts the against evidence down, and then the other side puts the for evidence down, and you're sitting there on that jury or you're the judge, how do you make a decision? Well, if all of a sudden, and this is my animation here on the screen, this feather floats down and ever so gently lands on one side of the case, as a juror, there is now slightly more evidence on the for side, and therefore you would vote that way. That's how civil cases are decided. And I would say that when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, if you get to the point where you believe there's just a little bit more evidence that he did rise than he didn't rise, I think the smart thing to do is go on the side where there's a little bit more evidence. And I think there's a lot more than that. It's just once you reach this level, it's probably a smart thing to go ahead and embrace the resurrection for having really occurred. The next standard is called clear and convincing, and that's evidence that leaves you with the firm belief that there is a high probability that the evidence is far more likely to be true than false. However, all of these levels in a criminal case would render a verdict of not guilty. The highest standard is called beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's that of which you can find a person guilty. And that's guilty. It means that there is no other reasonable explanation that can come from the evidence, and the jury must be virtually certain of the defendant's guilt. Does the resurrection reach this level? There are many believe that it does. So tonight, as we look into this, we're going to examine the evidence, and you are the judge. However, understand that a verdict does not create reality. Believing Jesus rose from the dead is not what makes it true. No more than believing Jesus did not rise from the dead is what makes that true. He either rose from the dead or he didn't rise from the dead, irregardless of what you believe. And we are going to submit to you that he did rise, and the evidence shows that. So as a judge, you are expected to fairly weigh the evidence, set your feelings and prejudices and preconceived ideas aside, and then you're responsible to come to the right verdict. So there's an incredible amount of evidence, so let's look into it. And the first question I have as a detective about Easter is what's going on with it. Why? It's all over the map of when you celebrate Easter. We know when you celebrate Christmas, Independence Day, Valentine's Day, Halloween. We virtually know all the big days, but Easter doesn't even pick a month. It can be in March, it can be April. So what's going on with this? How do they determine when Easter is? Well, three things has to happen, and it has to happen in a particular order. The very first thing that has to happen with Easter is the first day of spring has to occur. So Easter can never be in the winter. It has to be in the spring. And then, this is going to seem like I'm making this up, but I'm not. The next thing that has to happen is a full moon. And then the very next thing that has to happen is it's the next Sunday after the full moon. So the first day of spring, then the full moon, then the following Sunday. So for instance, in 2022, this year, the first day of spring was on March 20th, but for the rest of the month, there was no full moon. So the full moon happened the next month, and it happened on April 16th. So when would Easter be? The following day on the 17th. So just for your information, not that this is going to affect your lives a whole lot, but the earliest Easter can be is March 22nd. And the last time that happened was when James Monroe was the President of the United States in the year 1818. So this one doesn't roll around too often. But you'll be happy to know we will be celebrating Easter at the earliest possible date when we're in heaven, because the next time it happens is in the year 2285. It does not happen very often. But then the latest it can be is April 25th. And the next time that will be is in just about 16 years, the year 2038. It'll be on April 25th. So we're going to look at some people that have studied the resurrection. I want you to see some of their comments. And the first person I wanted to show you is Dr. Paul Meyer. He's a professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University. He's considered an intellectual giant. He could take intricate things and make them simple. He's written historic novels about Pilate, Jesus, the resurrection, and the first Christmas. And this intellectual historian said, and I quote, "If all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was actually empty on the third day." Then John Copley. That's the most recent photo I have of him. He was a great legal mind in Great Britain. He held almost all the highest offices as a legal expert could hold in England. He was the Attorney General. 3 times he was the High Chancellor, and he was elected the High Steward of the University of Cambridge. After his death in 1863, they found some of his papers in his office, and they came across a handwritten piece of paper, and inscribed on it he had written, "No intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true." And then Sir Lionel Luckhoo, was a politician, diplomat, and lawyer, and he's got a record that I'm not particularly thrilled of, but it is his record. He got 245 murderers off their charges in a row. If you were a murderer, he was the attorney to hire. But he also looked into the evidence of the resurrection, and one of the world's best lawyers with their success record said, and I quote, "I have been fortunate to secure a number of successes in jury trials, and I say unequivocally, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." Remember that pyramid? He was right there at the top, that the resurrection does hit the beyond reasonable doubt level. And last, I want to tell you about this good-looking guy, Dr. Simon Greenleaf. He is significant. He was a professor of law at Harvard University in the mid-1800s. He was just one of two professors credited for the rise of Harvard Law School to the eminent position among legal experts in the United States and legal schools. He is highly skilled expert in the handling of evidence. His 3 volumes called The Laws of Legal Evidence are still used in some classrooms today. His books are used to evaluate evidence in court and see if it's credible. He was an agnostic, a skeptic, he was not a believer, and he mocked the Christian students in his classroom who profess any faith in the Bible. So he had was going to take a year off for a sabbatical, and some students challenged him to use his own books, his own expertise, and apply his principles of evidence to the resurrection. He accepted their challenge, and he took that sabbatical to study and examine everything. After examining the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, he concluded, according to the laws of legal evidence used in the courts of law, there is more evidence for the historical fact of the resurrection of Jesus Christ than just about any other event in history. That is huge. So you may be saying, so what? So what do we care about what these guys that are no longer with us, what do we care about what they said? Well, I'm going to tell you what the so what is. We care because I had a case one time. It was a serial burglar. We had a serial burglar hitting in our county, and he'd gone into a number of businesses, and we had no idea who he was. He had been involved in dozens of break-ins of businesses going in and taking their cash. We had no idea who was doing it. But I finally got the case that ended up identifying him because as he went through he would break the glass out, usually doors or windows, and he cut himself going in. So he dripped his DNA all over the inside of the floor of this freshly mopped floor. Isn't that nice? They had just mopped it the night before, and his DNA was put all over it. So we submitted the DNA to the lab, and convicted felons are required to give a sample of their DNA for purposes like this, and it matched him up. And so I got a warrant for his arrest based on his DNA. And so when he's arrested, I go to the jail to interview him. And his response was, in essence, so what? You got my DNA. It was almost like saying, like, what else you got? And I'm sitting there and I said, you do know that your DNA is better than dropping your wallet or your cell phone. Your DNA is better than a high-def video of the entire crime with a close-up of your face. And your DNA eliminates every other person on the globe as a suspect. And your DNA means that you're the only person in the world that could have done this. But other than that, so what? So let's go back to Simon Greenleaf. He was a hardcore atheist who, if anyone knows how to read evidence, it's him. This guy is one of the most brilliant legal minds in our country's history. He reluctantly looks at the evidence for the resurrection, and the evidence turns his world upside down. His conversion should make any skeptic pause and say, what on earth did Dr. Greenleaf discover that obviously I don't know? It had to have shocked him to find an overwhelming amount of evidence. Evidence that convinced him beyond a reasonable doubt. Because his entire life changed as a result of this. He began writing Christian books on the evidence for the resurrection and other historical stories in the Bible. And Dr. Simon's Greenleaf is huge, and it's worth remembering as Christians, and it's worth noting as skeptics. So why is the resurrection important? Well, Christianity is not based on an ethic or a philosophy. It's based on an actual historic event, that being the resurrection. If there was no resurrection, there is no salvation. And all of Christianity crumbles if the resurrection story is not true. Now, it may sound like I'm being a little bit dramatic and overstating it, but look at what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15. He said, and if Christ has not been raised, your faith is what? Worthless. And by the way, you're still in your sins. So, conclusion, without the resurrection, there is no Christianity. Now, former atheist C.S. Lewis, most famous for being the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, he's been called the Apostle of Skeptics because, like Dr. Simon Greenleaf, he too was an agnostic and an atheist. And he said, after investigating the evidences for the resurrection, he said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. In other words, Christianity is either everything or it's absolutely nothing. There's no in between. So one of the first things we're going to look at in terms of the resurrection is how it was handled through messianic prophecies. So sometimes God would work through godless leaders to help bring about his purposes. For instance, and I just want to quickly go through this to give you a for instance, Jesus' birth. If you look at the map up there, there was a little bit of a problem. Mary and her soon-to-be-born baby was up in Nazareth, which is in the northern part of Israel, as seen on the map. And the prophecies have said that the Messiah was going to be born in the city of David, Bethlehem, a mere 90 miles away. Now, if you look just above that lower arrow where is where Jerusalem is, just to give you a reference. And so what has to happen? Mary's about to give birth to this baby, but she needs to get down to Bethlehem for it to be born. She doesn't know that, and she has no plans of going there. So God works in Caesar Augustus, and God tells him you need to conduct a census. And what was required by laws when they did a census, you had to go back to your place of birth to be counted in the census. So Joseph was from Bethlehem. So it required them to make that 90-mile trip as someone that was 9 months pregnant, and they didn't have trains, planes, or automobiles. But God worked through a godless leader to accomplish his goals, and the Messiah was in fact born in Bethlehem. Let's look at some fun facts concerning messianic prophecies. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament messianic prophecies. 29 of the prophecies were related to his last 24 hours and totally out of his control. For instance, Psalm 22, lots of prophecies in that book. A gang of evildoers has closed in on me. They pierced my hands and feet. Here is the crucifixion, the manner of death of the Messiah being predicted, and guess what? Crucifixion had not even yet been invented. And here is the Old Testament telling you how the Messiah was going to meet his demise. Look what else this prophecy says. They divided my garments up among them, and they cast lots for my clothing, which we know is what happened at the foot of the cross when Jesus was crucified. But one of the most absolutely amazing prophecies occurs in the book of Daniel, chapter 9. It's called the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And if any pastor ends up watching this, I will tell you they're going to cringe because this is supposed to be an entire sermon. and I'm going to go through in about 3 minutes. So I'm leaving a lot out, but I'm giving the highlights so you can get exactly what is prophesied here, and then you can go back if you're interested and get all the details. But what happened is this prophecy in Daniel was written in 537 BC. And what the prophecy said is that a decree will be issued to rebuild Jerusalem because Babylon had gone in there, taken them into captivity, and they destroyed the city. So the prophecy says a decree at some point in the future will go forth to rebuild Jerusalem. And when that happens, but that did happen in 92 years later on March 14th at 445 BC by King Xerxes. Now you may say, well, how do you get that date, March 14th, 445 BC? Well, it's mentioned, there's enough information where it actually does give a date in Nehemiah chapter 2 as to when the decree was issued to rebuild Jerusalem. Look at this. This is incredible. Daniel's prophecy goes on to say in chapter 9, verse 26, that 483 years after the decree is issued, the Messiah will be cut off, meaning he will be killed. So, what is this saying? It's saying starting on March 14th, 445 BC, and going forward 483 years, that takes you to, get this, the date of April 6th, 32 AD. That's amazing that many years later that this is fulfilled to the day when the Messiah would be cut off or killed. Now I'm going to tell you, if you want to go back and research this and see and check this out, it can be done, but it's difficult. And I'm going to tell you why it's difficult. When the prophecy was initially made, it was under the Sumerian calendar, which was a 354-day-year calendar. But then in 45 BC, we switched to the Julian calendar, which is what we use today, 365 days and a quarter. So that means if you want to calculate all this out, you have to calculate the different days of the year that under the Julian versus the Sumerian. You have to add a leap day every 4 years. You have to realize that there's no year between 1 BC and 1 AD. And somehow I think the Back to the Future time machine somehow affects the years or whatever. But anyway, the dates and calculations are all spelled out in Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, on page 59. So if you want to see how it was calculated all out, there's where you can find it. Let's move on. So there is a lot of math involved, but if you like math, then go for it. The last thing I want to tell you is Jesus predicted 50 additional prophecies during his life. For instance, he said in John chapter 2, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now there's some people that believe he was talking about the temple because he was in the temple when he gave this prophecy, and they go, oh, he's talking about the temple that was in Jerusalem. But the problem is that 2 verses later, in John 2:21, it says he was speaking of the temple of his body. Meaning what Jesus said is destroy this body, and in 3 days this body will rise up. Now if you think that's it's kind of hard to ascertain that. How's this for clarity? In Matthew chapter 17, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the 3rd day. It can't get any clearer than that. It appears that Jesus' enemies understood this, even though the disciples, they heard this, it went over their head each and every time. Because they sat there and go, what is he talking about? I don't get it. Is this one of these parables where we won't really follow along about what he really means? So let's look at the next thing. There's some pre-resurrection details. And the first thing I want to go over is the arrest of Jesus. But there's a lot that happened before this. So this would be Thursday evening, the day before Good Friday. Look at all the historical things that took place on this day. The first thing is the Passover begins. Thursday, as the sun goes down, the Passover would begin. And then the disciples and Jesus have the Last Supper, which was a Passover meal in celebration. And Jesus then washes the disciples' feet, to include Judas. Jesus then announces the betrayal, that someone is going to betray him in the group. And then Judas leaves to betray him, thus fulfilling the prophecy in Psalm 41. Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread. They just had the Passover meal. And so they're not even telling you that it's going to happen. They're telling you what they're going to do when it happens. It's an incredible prophecy. Someone who shared my bread has turned against me. And it goes on to say, so they paid me 30 pieces of silver. That's very specific. You know, if they want, they could have been getting credit for fulfilling the prophecy, just saying he was going to be paid for it. But not only does the prophecy says exactly how much money, he tells you the coinage. And by the way, when this prophecy was given, silver was not used as currency. So prior to silver being used in currency, this is predicted that the silver currency will be what is used to betray the Lord. And then how much was 30 pieces of silver? If you use 2022 value of silver, the value of these 30 pieces of silver is approximately $330 today. So they, obviously, you know, Judas threw it back at the temple. And what did they do with the money? What did the Pharisees do with the money when he threw it back? They used it to buy a potter's field. This doesn't have any huge significant, spiritual implications, but the biggest potter's field is still used in the world. Do you know where it is? New York City. It's in Hart Island, offshore from the Bronx. It's 131 acres of unclaimed bodies in pine coffins, and they're ferried there to this uninhabited island. More than 1 million people are buried on this 131 acres, and they bury them 5 deep. So Potter's Field, that's what was used with this money, this very specific prophecy. So Jesus then, the same evening, tells Peter that he will deny him 3 times before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. They then go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus prays about what's getting ready to take place. The disciples find that this is a good time to take a nap, even though Jesus asked them to pray. Jesus is then arrested. Let's look at the verse. Well, I need to tell you this before I show you this verse. What does this have to do with this? Moses is told to go into Egypt and to lead his people out of slavery and go before the Pharaoh. And Moses said, well, there's a lot of gods. Who should I say you are that's telling me to go let your people free, let them go? And the verse says in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, I am who I am. And he said, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now you need to know that before we look at this verse. So here's the betrayal. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Now, contained in this verse, you may not realize what on earth is a Roman cohort. How many people came to arrest Jesus? You're going to find this pretty amazing if you don't know this. But how many soldiers came to arrest Jesus? Well, first of all, a cohort was a mere 480 soldiers. All right? Now, that does not include the supervising officers of the cohort. But the verse goes on to say, in the same verse, that it wasn't just them, but chief priest officers and guards came, along with Pharisees officers and guards came. It is estimated that the number of soldiers and guards and officers that came to arrest Jesus was 600 people to arrest Jesus. That is absolutely crazy. So, just to let you know, 6 officers took down Bonnie and Clyde, 22 officers took down John Dillinger, and 79 soldiers of our highest trained military soldiers were what was used for the Bin Laden raid when he was shot and killed. 600 came to arrest Jesus, who had no history of violence like these other criminals that I just told you about. So, knowing that everything was about to take place in John 18, they went out and said to him, Jesus is talking to this guard. He says, "Who are you seeking?" And he said, "Jesus of Nazareth." They answered. And then Jesus said, "I am." Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing there. So Jesus here is invoking the name of the God of the Old Testament, calling himself that God. Now look at what happened right when he said that. And can you imagine being one of these guards? Look at this, what the rest of the verse said. Oops. When Jesus told them, "I am," they stepped back and fell to the ground. All 600 of them went over like bowling pins when he claimed the power of that name of who he in fact was, of God. I can't imagine getting up off the ground going, "What on earth are we doing here? Can I go home?" I'd ask my supervisor, "I'm not feeling good. Can I go on home?" But what else happened this night after the arrest? Well, Peter cuts off a guard's ear. Now, he was going for a headshot. I think he was trying to cut his head off, and he could only get his ear. And Jesus, of course, restores his ears. So what happens after the arrest? Right after the arrest becomes the trials. And the first 3 trials were illegal, because it was illegal to do nighttime trials. And these were all 3 of these first 3. Jesus had 6 trials. And the first 3 were all done at night. So we're going to go through these kind of fast. The first one was Presiding Annas. He was the former high priest. He was very powerful, influential high priest. He shows up also at the trials of Peter and John years later. Well, the result is he can't do much, so he sends them to the current high priest, which is Caiaphas. Caiaphas was Annas' father-in-law. So he was ruler over the Sadducees. He had wealth and power. And Caiaphas is the person that in the trial asked Jesus, "Are you the Messiah?" And when Jesus said he was, he's the one that ripped and tore his robe and cried out, "Blasphemy!" for Jesus claiming that he was the Messiah. So he announced Jesus was worthy of death, but he had no authority to carry out any type of sentence. So then they sent him to the next court, was the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish Supreme Court. The Sanhedrin was originally set up under Moses, who had been commanded by God to have it assembled. They found Jesus guilty, and they turned him then over to the Roman authorities, who asked him to be crucified, which, by the way, was another prophecy, because the Jews during Jesus' lifetime lost the right to condemn someone and put them to death. The Romans stopped them from doing that. That is one of the prophecies in the Old Testament that would take place. But we don't have time for me to go into it, although I just mentioned it for some unknown reason. All right, so where did he go from there? He got sent to Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. Pilate was very reluctant to put Jesus to death. Why? Well, history teaches that Pilate had a reputation of being very brutal, and he killed a lot of people. So much so that the word got back to Caesar that he had been killing way too many people, more than the other governors. And Caesar got word back to Pilate saying, "Cut the number of deaths or I'm going to remove you from the governorship." So here comes this non-violent person who didn't break any of the Roman laws, and they're asking him to be put to death. He genuinely thought Jesus had done nothing wrong, and he didn't want to do anything, he didn't want any more unnecessary killings because it could cost him his governorship. Well, remember, this was at the Passover, and so it's revealed that Jesus was from the Galilee area, and Pilate says, "Oh my goodness, Herod is in town for the Passover, and that is Herod's jurisdiction. So I'm going to send Jesus over to Herod. He's just a couple blocks away." So Pilate punts Jesus over to Herod. And there are 4 Herods in the Bible, and they're all from the same family. This one was the son of Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the one that had all the infants, males, when Jesus was a baby, put to death. Kind of crazy if you ask me. This is the Herod that divorced his wife so he could marry his half-brother's wife. John the Baptist spoke out publicly against him, which resulted in John's arrest and his eventual beheading. Herod is excited, though, to see Jesus because he wants him to perform a miracle. And Jesus does not do any miracles for him. So Jesus doesn't give him a private showing. And so Herod's soldiers ridicule him and beat him. And then he punts him back to Pilate. So Pilate, again, tries to satisfy the wrath of the crowd by commanding that Jesus be beaten instead of crucified. And then he said, I'll tell you what, I'll release Barabbas, whom no one liked, who was a vicious murderer, he was a notorious murderer at that time. He says, I'll release Barabbas or Jesus. And then the crowd said, that's an easy one. Release Barabbas. Jesus has to be put to death. That's how much he was hated. So Pilate reluctantly keeps saying, I don't see where he's done anything deserving of death. So Pilate sentenced him to death. And so what were his crimes exactly? Well, Jesus was accused of committing the following: blasphemy, where he said he claimed to be God. In John chapter 10, look at the verse. He says, I and the Father are one. And the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Again, meaning they've done it before. This is not the first time they picked up stones to stone Jesus for what they were calling blasphemy. So Jesus answered them, I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? And the Jews answered, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. You know, there are people that say Jesus never claimed to be God. Right here is very clear. And it's also very clear that the people who would have known more about what he meant and what he said were right there in front of him. And he clearly claimed to be God, and they wanted to kill him for it. The other crime was he had claimed to be the Messiah. So both of those, the Jews thought made him worthy of death. But the Romans could care less about those two things. They didn't care. So they brought in some stuff that they thought the Romans would care about. Sedition. They charged Jesus with sedition. Now that's inciting people to rebel against the state of their government. So they said that Jesus had told people the first thing, don't pay your taxes, which was a lie. He never said that. In fact, he said the opposite. He told people to pay, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar. And it was a question about tax. And then render to God the things that are God. He never said that. It was a lie. The other crime was he claimed to be king of the Jews. And the Roman law that would have violated is that in Rome they allowed no other king but Caesar. Pilate still did not think this was worthy of death. But to appease the crowd, he sentenced Jesus to die as a criminal. And it is Pilate, is the same Pilate, who later orders the Praetorian Guard to go stand around the tomb to protect it, to make sure that the body doesn't come out and no one goes in. Now, some historical records tell us that Pilate did lose his governorship after some time, and he committed suicide, and he experienced, after his demotion, that he felt great remorse for his involvement with the killing of Jesus. So what happened after the trials and they found him guilty? Well, remember, Pilate said he was going to go have him beaten or scourged. So many people died from Roman beatings. Jesus was stripped naked for the beating. Here's a picture of what the whip would have looked like. The whip had different lengths of braids so that when the whip would come down across your back, it wouldn't just hit one area, but would hit several areas of your back. The design of the whip snagged the skin and tore the flesh. The leather straps that you see there would have metal ball leads, rocks, and pieces of bone that would produce large, deep bruises and would cut through the skin. Subsequent blows would cut deeper, causing blood to go from oozing to spurting once the whip began to hit capillaries, veins, and arteries. The skin would begin to peel off and unravel in long ribbons, making that area of the body totally unrecognizable. Due to the enormous amount of blood loss, the victim would usually go into hypovolemic shock. Hypovolemic means a low volume of blood. So much blood was drained out of him from those beatings that he was starting to go into this hypervolemic shock. The scourging was supervised by a centurion who was to stop the beating if the prisoner looked like they were near death. And they would, in mocking Jesus, they put a crown of thorns on his head and smashed it into his head. As you can see by the photo here, those thorns were about 1 inch long, incredibly sharp, and it made Jesus look like this is probably an attractive picture of what he really looked like. His skin was completely unrecognizable. And they also put a purple robe representing royalty on him and would bow down to him in mockery. And they gave him a wooden scepter, and then they would yank it out of his hand and they would use that scepter to beat him. All right, so that ends up about his beating and what happened after his arrest. So next we're gonna take a break, but next we're gonna look at the crucifixion and the horrors that occurred during that time, and which will then, of course, lead into the resurrection. So let's take a quick break.